Hey, my name is Max Strawn, and welcome to Making Metal with Max. On today's episode, we're going to be talking a little bit more about metallurgy, specifically talking about grain development and rolling and casting. So I hope you enjoy this episode. All right, so on today's episode, we're going to be talking more about some of the important things in metallurgy. We talked about ore and iron. We talked about how we make steel. We talked a little bit about hardness, and we talked about carbon, oxygen, lots of concepts that we've been going over. And we're at the point now where we're producing steel, and we're looking to order it and buy it and weld with it and build things with it. At that point, we're going to be talking about the rolling and casting of the material and why that's important. Okay, so again, we're going to start like always with why. Why is knowing about rolling and casting processes important? And I said it during the intro that, we're going to be talking about grain development. Now, the formation of grains within steel is incredibly important, and whether you roll it or cast it makes a huge difference on what's happening with that grain development inside of the steel. So let's start right at the beginning, and we're going to talk about a couple things that are important when we talk about materials, and that's ductility and malleability, all right? So let's start with ductility. People always get confused between the two, and they're always trying to remember, especially if you're in college or you're going through your learning steps, which one's which, what happens. So ductility is a simple way to remember it is I can make a wire out of something that's ductile, all right? So it's the ability to be drawn into a shape. So what does that mean to draw something into a shape? So for example, if I start with a block of steel, okay, and I start putting it through rollers, I can start squishing it and squishing it and squishing it, and at the end, I can end up with a wire. Now, whatever hardness and flexibility, elasticity, any type of attributes that the steel has to start with, so here X, gets maintained along the way, and I produce a wire that is X. So it has nothing to do with changing variables at this point, okay? Now, it's always really interesting to note that this is a different world than the carbon world when we're talking about hardness. If I have a wire, or a material, that has high carbon, it's hard, okay? Now, that material, depending on how I make it, may or may not be ductile, okay? If I have a hard material and I make a hard wire out of it, that was a ductile material with a lot of carbon or a lot of hardness to it from the carbon. But there's also different ways that we can create hardnesses within steel, which we're going to come across in the next few areas. Another way to remember ductility is that it's based on tensile strength. Okay, so tensile is the ability to be pulled. So remember, like the wire, we're pulling it. So if I have a piece, or I should say, let's say a bar of metal, here I got a big bar, and I just start pulling at it from both ends. If this piece was not ductile, okay, so it was a piece that, I'm not talking about hardness here, it just has a low ductility. When I pull it both ways, it's going to just snap at some point. It's not going to stretch, okay? If it is ductile, what I'll have is that I'll pull and I'll pull and I'll pull, and it'll get longer and longer, and eventually it'll break, but it'll be like this. It'll squish out. Now, without getting too intricate in terms of the transition of atoms or energy within the material, because what's happening in a ductile material is that the atoms are allowing them to restructure themselves through an exchange of electrons that stops the material from breaking. Okay, so instead of it just being like, I can't do it, snap, and then that bond just rips, and then it follows a grain boundary across it, and you get the crack, on a ductile material, it'll actually bend the lattice, the structure, and move atoms correspondingly in order to maintain its life, in order to hold on to each other. And that's what causes the elongation and tensile products here, which creates the long, drawn-out area. All right? So when something is ductile, I can make a wire. Okay. Now, when something's malleable, I can hammer this. So this is hammer. So hammer, boom. There's my hammer. Okay. I'm going to hammer things and I'm going to force them into shape. So what we're talking about is compressive strength. Compressive. So ductile, tensile, malleable, compression, compressive. So that means I'm hitting it with a hammer and I can hammer it down, hammer it down, hammer it down, and I end up with a thin material. Now that was all done through compressive strength, and the material did not break at any point. It just squished, hammer, 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 and I can pound it out, kind of like clay, and it'll just spread out into a sheet or like dough. Right? It's very malleable that I can turn it into a sheet, or in terms of like gold and silver, I can make leaf. I can get so thin that it's like thinner than paper and it'll still hold itself. And again, like ductility, if something is malleable, I start with attributes X and I maintain attributes X from beginning to end. Now again, this doesn't have anything to do with changing of carbon or hardness. Okay, this material is the same material throughout. I can have a high carbon, I can have a no carbon, right? I can have ferrous, I can have non-ferrous. All crystalline structures will have some version of ductility or malleability within them. Now, most of the metalworking materials that we have are used because they are both ductile and malleable. For example, people often wonder why gold is so valuable. Well, gold is one of those rare minerals, rare crystals or materials on this planet that is both extremely ductile and extremely malleable. Now, because it does both, its grain structures a certain way that it allows it to be squished and stretched. It also, because of that same grain structure, it has very good conductivity of both electricity and heat, right? So things go hand in hand. All the little attributes of a material contribute to its overall ability to either work with or deal with heats and energy. All right? So we got ductile, we got malleable, we got a little bit better understanding about that. All right? So now we're going to talk a little bit about the actual grain structure. So the grains. So what's a grain? So grain formation. Okay. So I could have a material. So this was back, let's go back a lesson, and I'm at my basic oxygen furnace, and I pour in my steel, okay? And then I got my ingot of steel. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever noticed, but steel has a grain, just like wood, just like so many other things in our world. There's layers of how something forms. Why? Why would something have layers? Well, because nothing is instant. Things happen through a correlation of time and place, all right? So I'm pouring metal into here. My container is not hot or less hot than the red magma material that I'm pouring into it, all right? As it hits here, it's going to start filling up. My edges are going to be cooler with a hot core center. Okay, following? Now, I fill this up and I push it over here in the cooling area. And my heat is not going to be distributed evenly. Okay? Things are going to have different points of cooling down. And what happens is that you'll get seeds. So what's a seed? A grain seed is the first atom that freezes. So when I talk about something going from liquid to frozen, water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. Well, steel freezes at 1300 or 1100, whatever number you want to use, degrees Celsius, okay? So it's when you go from liquid back to a solid. Doesn't matter what temperature that is. There's a point where the first molecule in the batch hits that temperature. They're not all going to hit the temperature at the exact same time. That's just impossible. There's going to be spots where it happens. If you look up at a cloud and it's full of water and it's going to rain, there's that first migration of water to water where it becomes heavy enough to saturate and drop from the cloud, which starts a chain reaction of rain. Same with snow. Okay, so water is always a great example because it has very big and easily definable grains. All right. Now in steel, it's much more compressed, much tighter lattice, but it's the same thing. In this steel, I'm going to have points where it's reached the freezing temperature first, and they will spread and create crystals. Now, in a perfect environment, like I'm talking perfect, like utopia, okay, this could cool at the exact perfect ratio, which means that I would have one grain from end to end, but it's not going to happen in real world. This grain will run into these, which runs into that, which runs into this. And so you see what happens is that each seed starts their own little, basically their neighborhood. And that is a grain. And there's going to be a grain boundary where the grains or the neighborhoods meet. All right? Now that's very crucial when we're talking about steel, because that shape within, those grains within the material are going to reflect in how well it conducts electricity and how well it conducts heat. All right? And that changes a lot of things. Now also the size of grain also is going to have it's going to have attributes in relation to the hardness of the material. Okay? For example, this is just easy to remember. If you have small grains, it's harder. If you got large grains, it's softer. Why? Well, because I have a larger neighborhood of like-minded individuals, so I have much more flexibility and space to work with. On a smaller grain structure, the neighborhoods are smaller, you're going to have more grain boundaries, and that creates more hardnesses because there's differences in direction of the atomic structure. All right? Now, I'm talking about hardness and softness here. Keep in mind, I'm not talking about carbon. Okay? It's very, very often that those terms are thrown into the same bucket, and they're not in the same bucket. All right? I have a piece of material that is 0.2% carbon. So low carbon. I have another piece of 0.2% carbon. Okay? I heat this one up till its critical temperature. It's red hot. And I let it cool slowly, which is normalizing. Okay? And I heat this one up, same temperature, and I cool it quickly. This is the quick one. Okay? Which is called quenching. Okay? Now, in these two examples, my carbon has not changed. That's important to know. Okay? And when I do a normalized piece, I'm going to start with X hardness, and I'm going to finish with X hardness. Now, on this one, I start with X hardness, and I'm going to end at X plus. It's going to be harder. But the carbon hasn't changed. That's what tempering does. You're playing with the grains of the material. Now, yes, you can add carbon. Yes, you can remove carbons. But remember, you're talking different buckets now, all right? When we're talking about simple grain formation, we're talking about working with materials to either increase or decrease hardness based on grain size and grain growth, all right? So harder, normal, and I can anneal, which is over here, where I cool very slowly, and I'll end up at X minus, okay, which is softer because I allowed the grains to grow. So the larger the grains, right, the softer it is. The smaller the grains, the faster it cooled, the more seeds I have, right, and the harder the material gets, all right? Now, when we're talking about those grain, the grain formations within the structure, we're also talking about, aside from the seeds, we're talking about the size of the material. So thick materials versus thin materials, how fast they're going to cool. If I'm making plate steel versus 4-inch slabs, I'm going to have very different types of grain formations within that material. Also, the temperatures that I'm working at. If I maintain something hot longer, I'm going to allow for larger grains to develop, which allows that material to be softer and more workable. All right? Now, we've gotten to this part where we've talked about the seeds and the grains. Now, what do I do once those seeds and grains are in there? Okay, so here's my material, and let's just call this a normal low-carbon steel that I'm going to start working with. And I decided that I want to make wire out of it, which is a hard process because I got to draw it out, which means I have a ductile material and I'm going to plan on working on it. Well, these grains at the normal state, now we'll call it at the middle, are going to be susceptible to how I manipulate them. So in the instance of hot roll, I'm going to warm this up to allow these grains to kind of loosen up. Remember, we increase heat and the bonds get a little bit loose, right? And so the material gets a little bit easier to dice with, but it also might be more susceptible to tearing or microfractures or what they call lamellar issues, where the grain boundaries will actually separate a little bit. You don't want to get too hot. So you warm it up a little bit and you start the drawing process. Now these grains are going to get pulled in to here. And every roll that we go thinner and thinner, the grains are going to get longer and squished out, right? Because we're allowing motion. The little bit of heat that we're using when we hot roll basically squeezes the grains into a long conduit. So by the time we get up to the other end and we got a wire, we got nice, smooth grain formation that is directional. Now that's nice for electrodes, and that's nice for strength, right? Because all the strength that I've had into elongating that wire is maintained on an elongated direction, all right? So that's a good thing to have. But this is going to be quite soft in terms of the material because I've worked it through. Now, if you order steel and it's cold rolled, well, what does that mean? Well, cold rolled means that I have the same die, same system, but I'm not heating this up at all. And the materials, the grains, are going to be compressed, not so much in an elongated, but just in a general compressive state, where it's going to be compressed on all sides. And you're going to get a wire. Again, now the wire is going to be harder because I've squeezed the grains tighter through sheer force. Okay, so my grains have gotten tighter through compression in cold roll. So even though I started off with a low carbon steel, I now have a harder wire at the end than if it was hot rolled. Also, it's going to be cleaner, harder edges. It's going to have less oxidization issues because of the tighter grain structure, less ability for oxygen to creep its way in there. There's some benefits to cold rolled steel, but let me tell you, bending them is not the best idea because they're hard. So if you're going to make something out of cold rolled, you're going to have to factor that in if you're doing any forming or bending. All right? Now, on the other side of that, we have casting. So what happens in grain migration or grain formation with casting? What is casting? Casting is I have that same steel, right? It came out of my pot, my electric arc furnace or my basic oxygen furnace, and I have my ingot. And then I want to make, say, welding electrodes. Now, this is a bad example because, there's some cast welding electrodes, but why is that a bad idea? Okay, so what's a cast? I have a block. I have little 14-inch by 1/8 slots cut into it. And then I pour my steel into there, and I fill these little slots. I let it cool. I pop them out, and I got 4 1/8 by 14-inch cores that I want to make a welding electrode out of. Now, why wouldn't I do that? Why is that a bad idea? Well, because of the grains, right? When I have this here, and I have a my generic, I'm starting with grains in my ingot. When I heat this back up to liquid, I have now no grains, no boundaries, because it's liquid and loose. And I'm going to pour it in here, and it's going to just naturally form its own little grains within, based on its cooling, contact points, all those environments that we had before. Now they're going to be in little miniature versions, and there's no control of grain growth. So when I have this finished product, my grains are in every direction, and there's nothing stopping it. And how well will electricity go along the length of this wire if my grains are all over the place? It's not, right? So when I cast something, I am not worried about grains. I'm not looking for this to be further moved. I'm not looking for it to be electricity running through it. I'm not looking for it to be good with transmitting heat. It's the opposite. I'm looking for something that's going to absorb heat. Because of the bad pathways or the irregular driving lanes within the material, this will absorb heat, not distribute it. This will burn throughout instead of just on the ends first. This will deal with temperature, heat, and electricity much differently than a rolled piece of metal. Now, these are the same composition of metals. We're talking about low carbon, mild steel. And whether I cast it or roll it, I'm going to have a vast different array of products that I can create from it. And again, when I cast something, there's seeds. Those seeds are based on temperature, and they're based on how quickly or slowly I cool that material. Okay? Another quick thing to discuss in this section is martensite. I get this all the time. Students will come up to me and say, "Oh man, this is taking too long. I wish I could just quench my material and bend it, because it's taking too long to get on the bender." And I'll be like, go ahead. And they'll say, you're joking. You would never do that because it'll create martensite. And that's something that they get in their minds when they're taking metallurgy, because they hear that quenching causes martensite. And that is a half-truth at best. Okay? Martensite is dependent on carbon. So what is martensite? Well, martensite is when I have that lattice that we talked about the last couple episodes, and I have my carbons that are floating in here. So I have my low carbon steel, so I only have a few carbons, and this is low carbon. And what happens is that these atomic structures, right, are a certain size. Now, when I heat this up, they tend to loosen up, and it will expand. As we know, steel expands when you heat it up. So that means that each atom, as it's energized, will increase in volume because of its activity and the amount of energy it's storing within itself. It will expand, causing the whole structure to expand. Now, if you quench this, what happens is that it will all squeeze in. You have quenched it, caused those seeds to come back quicker and tighter, and you've decreased the grain size, made smaller, tighter grains, increased the volume of grain boundaries within material, which makes it much harder. But have you changed the carbon? No, you haven't. So can I get martensite from quenching low carbon steel? No, because nothing happened. The carbon is still in there. Yes, the material got harder, but that's because you quenched it and changed the grain growth, not because of any carbon. Martensite will only occur in medium to high carbon steels. Where I have enough carbons floating around that when this gets quenched and the quick contraction of the material actually smashes some of these together, and they will then collect and create a carbon deposit that will then disrupt the lattice. Now, that martensitic growth, which means that it's carbon caught in pools together that were not evenly dispersed because they weren't allowed the time to do that, that would have happened normally in a slow cooling process. In the quenching process, they were captured and stuck. And now that will cause carbon issues such as martensite. Now, that's only on medium to high carbon steels. So would I quench a test piece? You know what? If it's not red anymore, go hard. It's not going to really matter. If you're like if it's just hot, or like they say, just the spit test at around 400 degrees, quenching it should still bend fine. If you're a bad welder and it's going to break, it's going to break. Trust me. You can't get away from a bad weld. But if you've got a good clean weld in there, a quick sudden loss of heat at below a certain level, it's not going to matter. Now, would you? I don't know if anybody would actually want to do that, but it's not martensite that you're creating, okay? Now, the last thing I want to talk about real quick before we go to the next lesson that I want to get deep into the BCC and FCCs for the next course, because that's something people always ask me about. What the heck are those and what does that mean? I'm going to talk quickly about hot short, which is another neat thing with grain. So what is a hot short? We use this term all the time when we talk about aluminum and copper. Okay, aluminum and copper, Al and Cu. These materials, these minerals are very unique in the welding world. Okay, just like water is unique in the liquids world, because water increases when it gets hot, and also increases when it freezes, which it should not. Like really, almost nothing else does that. Well, aluminum and copper have some attributes that also not too many things have, and that is as temperatures increase, okay, ductility goes down. Now, generally, ductility goes down. So generally, most materials, as they get hotter or warmer, I mean, up to a point, once you get austenitic or to a a critical level, things just tend to collapse because the lattice is too much energy. But on these materials, it happens much sooner and in a weird window where they'll get warmer, and any heat added to aluminum or copper will actually cause them to short out or to separate, break apart. So aluminum and copper do not like heat well. They love to disperse it. Now, look, you're looking at the two, probably, these are the 2 out of the 3 best materials on the planet for conducting and heat and electricity. We use aluminum for heat sinks all the time because it'll distribute heat so fast. Its thermal, its electrical conductivity is off the charts. And copper is so good at absorbing and moving heat that we use it for wiring of houses for hundreds of kilometers in all over the place because it does that so well. But I can't weld them very easily because of their hot shortedness. If I try to have a piece of pipe and I heat it up and I go to bend it, it'll just snap. Okay? If I freeze it, it'll actually bend better frozen. Okay? So hot short is because of a different grain structure. And in many cases, you can look at them, and instead of being, a nice checker, if I had to compare, I got different types of grains. It's a different structure in a hot short, and that's why it'll react differently to temperatures and electricities. Okay? So always remember that hot shorts are a little bit different when we talk about rules of materials. All right. So again, this is me, Max. Hope you guys enjoyed the show. I've been getting some great feedback online. Been getting some ideas for things. If you guys have anything you want to ask me or request for me, let me know. I'm down. And, I love hearing what you guys are doing. And tell me about your college or your school or what you're doing in your garage, man. That'd be fun. I got lots of fun stuff going on, too. Next episode, we'll be talking a little bit about BCC and FCC, cubic states of materials, just quick to understand what that means and what's happening within temperatures. And then we're also going to start getting into maybe the classifications. We got lots coming up. I want to thank CWB Acorn for the materials and the slides and the work, the guys that do my post-production and editing. I want to thank the college, Sask Polytech. We're still teaching students. We're still going hard, and hopefully our students appreciate the work that's going in there. Can't wait to get back in the shop. I want to thank the people that are supporting me. CWB Association, that's always got my back. And again, I want to thank all the publishers of content out there. It's a hard job, and all you teachers out there, you guys keep working hard. We need to stay diverse. We need to stay cool. We need to stay on top of the technology. Don't fall behind. Don't be that dead potato. All right? Thanks again, guys.